And a very warm welcome to the city of Dunfermline. When I was MP, I was MP for 9 years, and one of the things that I used to try and do as MP when I had events like this in the city was to make sure that the sun was shining and everybody was walking a bright and sunny start. But now we're leaving MP, of course. It's pretty bleak out there, so especially for the pensioners. But anyway, that aside, Dunfermline is Scotland's 8th city, and we've got a relatively vibrant and mixed economy locally. We're currently sitting in the campus of Hyde College, and if you look that way, you'll see that out the ground is a completely new campus for the college. So this will maybe be one of the last events or major events that will be held in this building. So we've got a new college, and alongside that there's 2 new high schools being built as well. And in fact, both high schools are open, and the college will open early next year. So we've got a sense that despite some of the ravages of economic policy over the last 40 years or so, we feel that our future here is relatively bright, but we appreciate as well that is not the case across the whole of Scotland. And only by winning our independence, we believe that we can make a change to that. We can think of more of a much more positive economy, maybe a fairer economy for our people, and one where we can use all the resources of our nation to help us in that quest. But going back to Dunfermline, many of you will know, we've studied Scottish history over a period of time. Dunfermline takes a huge step back into Scottish history when we were the capital of an independent Scotland. To give you some idea of the importance and prominence of Dunfermline at that time, we have 7 kings, 2 queens and 3 royal princes buried in Dunfermline Abbey, which maybe gives you an idea of the strength of influence at that time. An international agreement between France and Scotland, known to many as the Aalborg Alliance, was signed in Dunfermline in the palace in 1295, and that agreement was later ratified by France some months later in Paris. So as time when I was an MP as well, I went to see the ambassador, French ambassador in London, and the consul here in Edinburgh as well, to see if that agreement still remained in place. Because I thought with Brexit coming on, I was trying to protect my constituents by making sure they can still be European citizens. Unfortunately, the Aalborg Alliance agreement has passed by the wayside in the intervening years. However, it's maybe something that we can return to. I'm sure there'll be lots of discussions over the next day or two, just to see what our best route is back into Europe, to see if we can rejoin our forces across the continent with our European friends. I know there's a really good lunchtime session on tomorrow, I think it is, around at 12 o'clock, talking about the importance of EFTA as opposed to rejoining the EU. So I think these are the kind of things that we should be talking about, putting on the table and actually seeing what is the best fit for Scotland, what advantages us most, either going back into the EU, as we were a member for so many years, or other ways that we can boost our economy, link up with peoples across the continent in a better way. Maybe EFTA might be another option we should be looking at. The final part about Dunfermline, I think, would be that it's also the birthplace of Andrew Carnegie, who in his day was the richest man in the world, made his fortune by making steel and building railroads the length and breadth of the United States. He went on, of course, to give most of his money away, either to build libraries or to put into universities and education. But I think one of the major acts of his philanthropy was to build the International Peace Palace in The Hague, which still operates today as the home of the International Court of Justice. So it's quite a significant legacy, not just for Dunfermline, but I think the thing around anti-Canadian that resonates globally and internationally, and that's something that we should all be proud of, and something that I'm certainly proud of in Dunfermline. Now, I think it was this time last year, I was coming around to the idea of retiring from Westminster, because it just wasn't, it certainly wasn't doing anything for me, I can tell you, and it certainly wasn't doing anything for Scotland that was of any significance. So I thought I might spend my time doing something else. So a lot of people have asked me since then, what do you miss about it? And I immediately replied, absolutely nothing, because it really, as I said, it doesn't really do very much for us here in Scotland as a whole. But what it did do for me as an individual was, I think, give you the opportunity to discuss and talk to people from all over the world, because London is, I think, a melting pot as far as that's concerned. And I took a great interest in Nordic and Arctic matters when I was in England as well. And I've made lots of Nordic friends, and really, I think there was a hoo-ha last year, wasn't there, when Angus Robertson wasn't allowed to talk to any people from foreign governments. We've been, as MPs, obviously, we never had that barrier in place, but often when you spoke to somebody from Denmark or Sweden or Norway or Faroes, their first question was, when is Scotland becoming independent? Because they are desperate that we become independent. And I thought, my goodness, you're much more keen than some of the people in Scotland are for Scotland to become independent. So we did a lot of work around Nordic Council, how we could be part of that, how we could actually make a contribution, and unfortunately we do need to be an independent state to be able to take part in that almost new family of nations that we want to be part of. But one of the things that I did manage to do is a lot
as well. Last year around this time I was in Helsinki, and it was to attend a conference of very young MPs and politicians, which I just sort of sneaked into that group and no more, being very young. And so it was a series of European think tanks that all got together, and they were thinking about how will European democracy look like in 5-10 years' time. And I think that's one of the things that probably we don't do very well in Scotland in terms of having think tanks. And I think conferences like this are the nearest thing we've got to actually having well-funded think tanks who can actually take a step back from everything and say, well, what is the best solution to this problem? How do we approach it? And one of the things that struck me at that conference, again, was just the breadth of views and knowledge, and it actually changed the way you think about things. People who were very much maybe on the left of politics, they were embracing some ideas that were on the other side, and vice versa. Or there were maybe some people who were, had their minds closed to ideas, were prepared to open their minds a wee bit, and just accept that to make this work, we need to do X, Y, or Z instead of doing A, B, and C. So it was actually a very interesting event, and I'm sure that if we can sort of mirror that sense of being respectful to each other's points of view during this conference as well, I think we'll get an awful lot out of it. But one of the first speakers at that conference, it was an Italian professor of the future, and he was also an advisor to the United Arab Emirates government, because they had developed something called the Ministry of Possibilities. So everybody was wondering, well, what does that mean? And this Irish MP stood up and said, how will we know when the possibilities have all been exhausted? And how will we measure the possibilities? And so he went into this big long conversation anyway about the Ministry of Possibilities. But I think, again, if with Tim's permission, maybe we should be thinking of ourselves as members of the Ministry of Possibilities for the next 24 to 48 hours, because it's a real way of easing some of the tensions that you might have about where policy is going, because I don't think we can rely on political parties to actually come up with ideas, because they seem to be idea-free zones at the moment. So I think it's up to the rest of us to actually come up with ideas that can take our country forward and move us on to independence. One of the things that I did notice when I was in Helsinki as well was we got a visit on the Sunday to a magnificent library. Excuse me. And if you ever get a chance to go to Helsinki, please go and visit it. It's just an amazing building. They have a library, yes. They have a cafe, yeah, which you probably normally expect. But they have areas where are dedicated to people making music, learning to play the guitar or a musical instrument. They've got another area that's got things like sewing machines and various other things that the citizens can access. So if they want to either repair their clothes, make their clothes, or whatever, design their clothes, then the facilities are there to do that. They've got an area where they've got 3D printers. So if you design something you want to make, then again, you can take it along to the library and they will put it through the 3D printer and make it. So that's the kind of thing that we should be thinking about in Scotland as well. Now, that building was built to celebrate 100 years of Finnish independence. So my question to you today, first question you've got to think about, is we could have been independent, and this could be our 10th anniversary this week. So what thing would you have done to celebrate 10 years of independence in Scotland had we had that opportunity? What big thing could we have come up with that would actually said that means we know we're an independent country, but this is a symbol of our confidence and our ambition for our nation. I thought, I had a wee think about that myself this morning. I thought it'd be great if we actually closed the very last food bank in 10 years into Scotland being independent. But maybe there's something else that you've got in your own mind that you'd want to think about. But what comes through when you visit Nordic countries as well is just that level of confidence, their clarity of vision, and their ambition. And they're absolutely superb at working across their national boundaries. So great example of where Scotland could be. Finally, today and tomorrow, I think we'll hear a lot about why this union that we're in is unsustainable. We're all struggling. Everybody's struggling with cost of living. Everybody's struggling with their energy bills still. Despite Scotland having as much, we've got renewable energy coming out of the ears. So it's not just going to be keeping our lights on in the future, it's going to be keeping our near neighbours' lights on in the future, whether they be across the border in England or whether they be into Europe. And so I think that there's a very serious choice that is before us in Scotland. We can either continue to be poor Brits because it ain't going to get any easier, or we can be affluent Scots. And that is a choice, and we need to choose wisely to make sure we get the benefits of being an independent nation. In the meantime, I say that please, with Tim's expert organisation, please enjoy the conference. There'll be a lot of ideas swirling around, but be confident, be open to having a clarity of purpose, and above all, I think, be ambitious, because we need to deliver something that we've never had before, and that's a country of our own. And it's time we did it.
To give you an idea, I'm currently in Bordeaux, which is pretty much the same, longitude as where you are in Dunfermline. And I'm absolutely gutted I'm not able to be there in person because, first of all, I absolutely love Scotland and Scottish people. I'm not going to say whether Wales or Scotland should be independent or not. Okay, it's not for me to say. Like there are pros and cons. It's a political choice. It's what people decide. So in what is going to follow, I will use independence as a working assumption. So my job is as an economist to say how to make it feasible and as good as possible for basically the people and the countries involved. Next slide. So with that in mind, this is the situation of the UK. So just taking very simple metrics, GDP per head at current market prices. So as you can see, Scotland in yellow is actually doing much better than Wales, which is pretty much the almost the at the in the last position in the race, so to speak. There's actually a case to say that London should have a different currency to the rest of the UK, because frankly, London is the outlier. And I mean, having lived in central London, then in Watford, yes, I can say when going to especially the north of England, you would sometimes feel in a different country, and I would say much more so than what could happen in. Of course, there are disparities in France, but I would say that going from yes, London to the Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds area sometimes could feel like being in a different country. I cannot see my slides anymore, so I don't know if there's an issue. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the report Currency Option for an Independent Wales was commissioned by the Plaid Cymru Senate Group in Wales. It was, next point, it was part of the submission of evidence for an independent commission on the constitutional future of Wales, which had previously asked how would an independent Wales establish its fiscal stability and credibility? What currency would it use? How would it maintain the confidence of the financial markets in the immediate aftermath of separation and in the medium longer term? So that was the brief. Next slide, please. So that's how the report is structured, and I will go through these points in the presentation. However, just before, just in case someone has read the report, is interested in reading it, and just to give a bit more intellectual background and context. Next slide. I will go through basically the kind of dominant paradigm in kind of currency area formation analysis, and which is something that I used when I was when I was a student, and like, even as a researcher, I'm still kind of evolving from that paradigm. So it's called the optimum currency area approach. It was developed in the 60s and 70s, but then because as you may remember, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Everything became floating, and there was a loss of interest for that theory. But it re-emerged during the inception of the euro area. So as of basically the 90s, especially the late 90s, there would be a lot of things to say about what was produced at the time, but that's not for now. But basically, if I had to put it very simply, what the theory says is there are pros and cons in forming a currency area. The pros, or the main pro, is you reduce transaction costs, which consist of conversion costs between the currencies, as well as exchange rate fluctuations. On the downside, you lose especially the exchange rate as an adjustment device, and this requires substitutes in place. One of them is to have labor mobility or factor mobility in general. Another one is to have fiscal transfers between regions, part of the currency area, so fiscal compensation. Next slide. So what is interesting is that from a technical perspective, the UK is an optimum currency area. Okay, it is. As a matter of fact, people can move from Wales to England, England to Scotland. There is fiscal redistribution between England and other regions. We can always discuss the amount and the modalities, but the truth is, if you compare to the Eurozone, for instance, it's not even comparable. The scale is completely different. So from a technical perspective, one could say, yes, the UK is an optimum currency area. However, there is very possibly a divergence in terms of the political perspectives and preferences between typically England and Wales and England and Scotland. And this is something that really matters. And the second point is that just the fact that you have those fiscal redistribution and labor mobility doesn't mean that the situation necessarily is optimal, because you could have a very an economic powerhouse, so typically London, draining forces, especially from Wales, draining all the brains, for instance, and then giving back money to Wales, but just to effectively kind of subsidize an effective situation of economic underdevelopment. So, and this is really something that I really realized while writing the report. I've become somewhat critical of the theory over time, especially experimenting, modeling, but I really realized while writing the report that it does need quite a bit of improvement still. Next slide, please. Okay. Also, generally speaking, for everybody interested in macroeconomics, there is this idea that you can treat fiscal and monetary policy as like two completely, um, two entities that live their own life. For instance, if you use the Moodle-Fleming model, it will say, oh, if you have a floating exchange rate, um, um, monetary policy is great, fiscal policy doesn't work. Whereas if you have a fixed exchange rate, fiscal policy is great, monetary policy doesn't work. Okay, so that's literally what students learn when they do international macroeconomics. Also, coming from the same authors, Mundell and Fleming, there's this idea that you can't at the same time have a fixed exchange rate, free capital movements or capital integration, and an independent monetary policy. Okay, there's nothing that's said about fiscal policy. This very well-known impossible trinity or trilemma does not talk about fiscal policy at all, because fiscal and monetary are supposed to, live separate lives. Whereas in reality, next slide, fiscal and monetary policy are intrinsically interconnected. There are so many ways of showing it, but just take the fact, for instance, that when you issue public debt, this has an impact on obviously interest rates on the market, unless the central bank intervenes in real time to neutralize the effects, which, when you think about it, is an obvious form of monetary policy intervention. So the government will affect interest rate conditions. Also, interest rate changes through the political channel will put pressure maybe on governments. And also, regarding the point on fiscal policy being best in fixed exchange rate setups, you will notice in the real world that there tend to be fiscal constraints. Especially look at the Eurozone. I mean, it's farcical. The amount of constraint put on national countries. It just deters any country from pursuing industrial policy, and it explains why the Eurozone has been lagging behind the US, let alone China, over the last 15 years. Next slide, please. Sorry, next point. Sorry, can you go back? Thank you. And also, and that's very, very, very important, and a point I will reiterate, which in the report I call the Greek trap. But when the central bank does not cooperate and intervene to smooth financial conditions to provide liquidity, especially on sovereign bond markets, you end up with a situation where political entities, governments, will be at the mercy of market speculation. And the extreme case is Greece in 2010, once it had been downgraded by rating agencies, when institutional investors could not hold the bonds anymore. Then you could see spikes in interest rates, and that was highly problematic. And this is really something any country such as Scotland or Wales, which would want to become independent, really has to keep in mind. If you don't have your own central bank, this might happen. Next slide, please. So the report starts as follows. I talk about the well-known situation of twin deficits in Wales, twin deficit being defined as the coexistence of fiscal and current account deficit. So roughly, we're talking about 13 to 15 billion pounds in 2022, which represents approximately 15 to 20% of Welsh GDP. The import and export patterns are slightly different, but somewhat alike. Roughly half of exports and imports are to and from the UK, and imports 16% from the EU, exports 29% to the EU. We're talking about Wales. This has implications. When you have a fiscal deficit, you need to issue public debt. So, like, you really need to think about it. Which currency will you issue in once you're independent? And secondly, you need to think in terms of, if you want to manage your exchange rate, you need to think about your foreign exchange reserves, because when you have a deficit, you're going to run out of them. Yeah, thank you. Next slide. Okay, John Doyle, who's from the University of Dublin in Ireland, also wrote a report for the Senate Commission, actually 2 reports last year, and in one of them he challenges the ONS figures, basically. And going through the accounts in great detail, he identified a number of items that could very well have to be reassessed after independence. I will go through the main ones. Yeah. Non-identifiable expenditure, £4.5 billion. So this is typically defense and nuclear weapons. This is something that really only England, like the core of the current UK, has an interest in, because it's to do with being a nuclear power, being in the Permanent Defense Council of the United Nations. Okay, public debt as well. The Wales would not inherit from the ratio of the existing public debt, so that would probably save to the tune of 2.5 billion. Pensions as well, nearly 6 billion. Other item 3 billion. So that reduces, according to Doyle, the total budget deficit by more than 10 billion. So that's quite a significant drop. Okay, and I won't say anything in terms of the trade and current account balance, because normally they tend to go hand in hand together, but the truth is the statistics are not granular and available to really be sure. However, one could reasonably assume that a lot of those things that count as imports might be the counterpart of intergovernment services within the UK. So it's very possible that the current account deficit of Wales would actually be lower after independence than the official estimate. Okay, so then I go into the general considerations on the choice of a currency regime. There are 6. Okay, the first one is trade implications. I think that's a very poor argument. It basically says, oh, you should not use a separate currency because there are costs of using that currency. It's not optimal. You should use a currency of a bigger area. Then I just want to ask, okay, how do you explain that Denmark, 5.5 billion people, uses its own currency? Switzerland, Norway, not Finland, they're in the euro area. But there are so many counterexamples. I think it's not a very, very good argument. Monetary policy freedom is the second one. It comes from what I talked about earlier, the impossible trinity. It is, in my opinion, monetary policy on its own has been sort of overestimated. I would say it's relevant, but only moderately so. Next slide, please. On the other hand, I would say that exchange rate as a policy tool is definitely something very, very important. Not necessarily to use all the time, but to know that you have it just in case. This is what Greece missed back in 2010. Like, had Greece kept its own currency, it would have been able to just devalue, a strong devaluation, but it would have been outside of troubles much faster and probably in much more preferable way for its own population. And that's why Denmark, for instance, is fixed, completely fixed against the euro, has been for 40 years, and first against the Deutschmark, now against the euro. But at least they know they have an exit door if they really need. Next point, thank you. So then there's the point about destabilizing fluctuations. I will go back to that one, but I just want to say that there is this tendency to only give the choice between 2 exchange rate regimes. So either you go for very, very fixed, like hard, or you go for pure float. I mean, there are many intermediary possibilities. Again, I will go back to this. Okay, fiscal policy restrictions. So if you join, when you're in the pound sterling area, or if you join the eurozone, or there would be fiscal policy restrictions. Okay, it's true. However, that only applies if you decide to join those areas. Wales on its own would not be facing the same set of restrictions. So that's okay. And the last one, I think, is actually the most underestimated in the whole literature, and it's only started to be considered seriously by a minority of economists, and I hope this is going to improve over time. But this is related to what I was saying earlier, that sort of independent life between fiscal and monetary policy, and not considering the implications, the financial stability implications of fiscal policy. But here I would say the fact that when you have your own currency, you can be more in command of your financial conditions is extremely important, and especially through the ability of the central bank to intervene. Okay, so this is a point that really needs considering, that is not talked about at all in theory, but in real life this is really not something that needs to be done proactively. It's to do with changing the currency in which some liabilities in particular are denominated. So you can just display all the points. I think there are 4. But basically, if you issued a Welsh currency, the same would apply for a Scottish currency. And if mortgages, for instance, were still in pounds, well, if your domestic currency depreciates against the Great British Pound, you would find yourself with real cost of repayment of mortgages going through the roof. And this is exactly what happened in Iceland in 2008. So obviously, especially for the most, so you can consider 2 types of agents. You have agents that professionally deal with exchange rate risks, especially financial agents, and you have agents who had no idea what it's about. And the latter, obviously, the biggest example is households, but you could also include small firms. Obviously, for those agents, it is imperative to change the currency in which liabilities are denominated. One straightforward solution is to implement something called currency swaps. This is something financial agents know very well about. I don't need to go too much into detail, but it's basically doable. Okay, then I investigated the Sterlingisation, defined as the belonging to the GBP area, but without being a formal member. So basically, you accept the rules and you don't have much of a say. Can you display the points, please? Okay, so there was the Scottish precedent in 2014. Scotland said, "Oh, we would keep the GBP," but Westminster said, "Absolutely not." So then there was this Plan B, keep using the sterling, but without a formal agreement. So okay, I'm going to say it loud and clear. This is a terrible idea. Like this is basically currency, monetary, fiscal suicide in waiting. So don't do that. Now, it's interesting to see that in its 2022 report, which was called A Stronger Economy with Independence, the Scottish government argued in favor of what they called a staggered approach to currency change, whereby Scotland would keep using the pound sterling until the time is right to move to a Scottish pound. Okay, I am speechless. Like, it's literally, this is basically created the conditions to never be able to issue your own currency because you're going to create so much financial instability, speculation. Like, this is awful. I hope the people who wrote that didn't write about climate change, or because then don't read it. By contrast, there's a study from Commonweal that argued very sensibly in favor of introducing Scottish currency ASAP. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I will now go through the arguments in favor of sterlingization. You don't need to redenominate the asset, no currency change. Then there's institutional stability, technological, cognitive, operational, and there's exchange rate stability. Okay, obviously no exchange rate risk, less fluctuations. You don't even need to change the currency, and it's a source of confidence for investors. Okay, now let's comment on these arguments a little. So next slide. Yep. Okay. So the first one, it's a double-edged sword. So actually, the argument comes from Commonweal, and it's absolutely it's spot on. If people expect that in the end you will issue your own currency, but you don't do it in the first place, this is going to introduce expectations like uncertainty, negative expectations that could turn into speculation. Like if they know, oh, in a couple of years, you're going to finally change the currency. All right, okay. Whereas if you do it immediately, at least it's done. In terms of institutional stability, there would be a lot of things to say. There will be transformations anyway. You may as well use economies of scale, like do everything at once in a consistent way instead of doing one, then the other, and so on. Also, handling of multiple currencies is already a thing. In terms of the exchange rate stability, again, there is this tendency to only oppose purely fixed versus purely floating regimes. I will go back to this. Next slide. Okay, now the arguments against sterlingization. Okay, so basically you would end up very constrained in your fiscal policy. I mean, Wales would end up very constrained in the fiscal policy. There's a very likely currency overvaluation because you keep in an exchange rate of 1-to-1, when maybe what you would need would be a currency 10 or 20% weaker to be more competitive. There wouldn't be fiscal transfers anymore. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. So currently, technically, the UK is an OCA, but you would lose fiscal transfers. So you would be using, I mean, Wales would be using someone else's currency, but without the fiscal transfers. So actually, they're worse off compared to the current situation in that respect. Also, they would be excluded from Bank of England asset purchase, and there wouldn't be any intervention of the central bank, of the dedicated central bank, in the form of lender of last resort or market maker of last resort. This basically opens the door to a lot of troubles. Next slide. So here, yeah, the verdict, it's a self-defeating strategy. It would actually make it harder to implement a Welsh currency further down the line, because there would be a structural current account deficit, so reduction in foreign exchange reserves, no possibility of devaluing, so the situation would remain bad unless they implemented a kind of internal devaluation like Greece did, but this is horrible from a socio-economic perspective, so I wouldn't really recommend doing that. Next point. Yeah, I mentioned this already. And yes, the absence of a central bank being able to intervene and to provide, like to stabilize financial condition it would be a disaster. And there are precedents. I mentioned Greece. There's also Puerto Rico in the US. There may be part of the US. They're like the 51st state of the US. They were left to their own and they had to default in 2017 or 18. So that's really something to keep in mind. Then there was the idea to join the Eurozone. Okay, I should mention this is something that played Cameroon. Some people felt strongly about. They thought, oh, we need to join the Euro. So I had to, well, this is definitely one thing where I sort of had to dampen their enthusiasm. All the more as having worked previously on the Eurozone, I'm actually quite critical of the way it works. You can, yeah, display all the points. I will go fast. So just the important picture here is you don't join the Eurozone overnight. First of all, you don't join the EU overnight. It takes at least a few years. And then once you're in the EU, there's another couple of year process to join the Eurozone. So you can count at least 4 to 5 years. Okay, so it's not something feasible in the short run. And keep in mind that there are advantages to not being in the EU. For instance, one like Wales or Scotland would be able to put tariffs on or capital controls that could be useful, especially in the early days. Next slide. Okay. Okay. Something to consider as well. Wales or Scotland joining the Eurozone, the rest of the UK would remain your trade partner. So you would basically anchor yourself to a set of countries that are not your main partner, and you would maybe probably fluctuate against your main partner. That's a bit dangerous, especially in the short run. Also, keep in mind there are governance issues with the Eurozone, and it's happening right now. There are restrictive policy rules in place in the Eurozone that are a disaster. Like I'm not kidding. It's awful. It's basically just preventing the Eurozone from having any kind of ambitious plan for the future, and it's still happening. So I would really not recommend joining the Eurozone to Wales or Scotland. And there would be, like, the EU is pretty big on free trade, so you would end up like, yeah, not being able to put in place things that could help, such as tariffs or capital controls, even temporarily. Okay, next slide. I think it's just, yeah, okay. So it's a long excerpt. I won't read it all, but here what I just want to say is what's in bold: transitioning to the Eurozone wouldn't change the peripheral status, but merely reposition Wales from the fringe of one currency area to another. So it's basically like going from one toxic relationship to another toxic relationship. Okay, not the best idea you could have. And what I recommend in the end is, yeah, consider 20 to 40 years from now, meaning, yeah, the world will have changed quite a bit. Okay, now I turn to the part about introducing a Welsh pound. Here are the arguments. There are two, but they're very strong. The first one is what you can do from a political perspective. Your autonomy is maximum. Fiscal, monetary, exchange rate. I could have even added like financial regulation, and also financial stability. You get a better grip over market conditions, and you especially remove any risk of default on your public debt, as long as there's no original sin, meaning the central bank does not borrow in a foreign currency. Okay, so if you have the Welsh pound or the Scottish pound, do not borrow in euro, do not borrow in GBP anymore. Okay, that's just risky for nothing. And that's the main predictor of government defaults. Next slide. Now, there are arguments against that you can read in the literature. So transition costs, exchange rate risks, loss of credibility, capital flights. Okay, so now next slide, I go through them. Okay, transition cost, it's true, but it's not that crazy when you think about it. And Wales would not be starting from like scratch. It's not like it's a wasteland and you would have to build everything from scratch. Exchange rate risks, it's a straw man. Okay, there are ways of mitigating fluctuations. I mean, I could talk about China or even Japan, or there are many ways of going about it. A loss of credibility, okay, this can be flipped on its head. Investors will prefer a country, even if the currency is depreciating, if there's a vision, a strategy, investors like that. Whereas if you stay in a union that is to your disadvantage, and clearly you're not consistent in your vision, investors will be scared. So I think it's yeah, it can be flipped on its head. And the last one, capital flights, yes, definitely, it's a possibility. For against that, either capital controls or from the start you devalue significantly, because once you've done that, you lower the expectations of further devaluation. Next slide. And I think I've got 5 minutes. I should be able to finish in 5 minutes. Okay. So that's the no yeah. The seventh part, I talk about the diversity of exchange rate regimes. It's a bit technical here. I will just give some like high level points, but it's just to show that there are many different things to consider. Like the possibilities are multifold when it comes to devising an exchange rate regime, and I think many of them are completely underused currently. You can define a central parity, fluctuations bands around that, or sometimes you don't even have a central parity. You can decide to peg against one or multiple currencies. You can use a crawling mechanism, which means a series of micro adjustments. And also you can play strategically on information disclosure, which Singapore in particular does. Next slide. So, for instance, if you are pressed, so if there's an issue with your exchange rate, you need to devalue. There are several ways of doing. The first one I show here is through parity adjustment. That's the best known. You just devalue and you will move the parity as well as the bands. The band will remain the same, and they just move along with the parity. The second one, this is what happened after Black Wednesday. You just they went from 2.25 to 15% around the parity, which is like creating a massive floating zone around the central parity. So yeah, but there's a third possibility, and that's the adjustment in the crawl, in the rate of crawl. I'm a big fan personally of crawling things. They have been underused in the first world. Some countries around elsewhere in the world use them. China did that, especially after 2007. Next slide. Okay, so I won't have time to go through it too much, but if you look at this is basically a decision tree to define your own like which currency like exchange rate regime you want. I just want to mention that in the literature, usually there's the choice between pure float, which is at the bottom right, and fixed peg, regular fixed peg. That's the second from the top. Okay, there's also crawling peg as an option, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other options or 4 other options in the right column. So just saying, there's a choice, okay, and so it's not a binary alternative. Next slide. Okay, so this is how roughly the world is. I mean, some examples of organization. On the left, you have the hard fixed regimes. On the right, the floating regimes. In the center, all the intermediary regimes. Notice that Bretton Woods was an intermediary regime. We had pretty good, like, there was financial stability at the time. China, from 78 to 2018, was in an intermediary regime situation. They recorded the best growth performance ever over a quarter of a century. Okay, so I'm just saying that there is actually a huge interest in looking at intermediate possibilities. Next slide. Okay, guidelines for the implementation of the Welsh Pound. I'm going to be honest, I think there are plenty of people more competent than me, more knowledgeable, especially as far as Scotland is concerned, and there are definitely other institutions to consider, but in what I suggested, which again was inspired greatly by the inception of the euro as well as the Commonweal report, I suggested 4 institutions: central bank, financial supervision agency, fiscal commission. I don't want it to be too like a crazy watchdog like the OBR, which will basically put restrictions on the government. The government abilities. I don't think that's a good idea, but to have a body that provides reliable information is important. But it should also have a counterpart in the form of Trade and Current Account Commission, especially as far as foreign exchange reserves and exchange rate management is concerned. Next slide. And I'm nearly done. Okay, the suggested timeline, the main items, year 1, you need to hire people, and you can implement the unit of account from a digital perspective. Year 2, you upgrade your banking system. You start implementing dual pricing, meaning people go to the supermarket, they will see the 2 currencies. When they get a bill, they will see 2 currencies, and so on. Year 3, final rollout, you would have the physical currency available. You use it for tax payments, and obviously you need to have denominated the balance sheet elements I mentioned previously. Okay, I know that was very fast for a 3-year thing. And this is something I added at the end of the report about like longer term strategy. So once you've redenominated, then you're able to use the exchange rate as a proper tool. So I would say in the case of Wales, I think a devaluation of at least 10%, I wanted to write 20%, but is probably very necessary because Wales will need to become more competitive to sort of to rebalance its trade and capital current account. Ideally, you may consider different options. I won't go too much into detail, but the main idea is when your exchange rate is too high, you're going to have a current account deficit. You will lose foreign exchange reserves. When it's low enough and you maintain it low, that's typically what China kind of did like 20 years ago. You will then be able to replenish your foreign exchange reserves. And once you have those foreign exchange reserves, subsequently, you will be able to defend the peg that you decide to implement. That's, for instance, why Denmark is able to have a very fixed peg and be very economically successful. Okay, conclusion. How does it apply to Scotland? I think a lot of it applies to Scotland. I mean, I don't think I need to convince you too much. However, let's face it, the situation of Scotland is different from that of Wales. The Scottish economy is more diversified, export-oriented. There's a more developed financial sector, and it already enjoys more devolved powers than Wales. So I think next slide, all those points tend to Scotland being better prepared, better equipped for currency transition. Next slide. And I think it would make sense for Scotland to become independent first rather than Wales doing it, because Scotland would be able to pave the way and maybe even help Wales. And I would say, especially in the event, that's the last point, especially in the event when England didn't play a very cooperative games with the two new independent countries, I think they would probably have to adopt cooperative policies. And I believe that's the end. There's a next slide, and I will not venture into pronouncing, but it's supposed to say merci in Welsh and Scottish Gaelic.
Thank you very much. That was a huge amount of information, I think, for our audience here. I'm a little bit concerned of how we would just take questions on that, because it was such a wide-ranging presentation. But let's have a go to see if anybody's got any particular questions that they wanted to ask. Yeah, there's Robin right at the back. You've got your own session after this, Robin, so...
That was brilliant. One of the things you said was that international financial markets like predictability more than necessarily just growth or more than just necessarily just one set of policies. What sorts of things might you do in the first 5 years of an independent nation to create maximum predictability for international finance markets?
Okay. Regarding a lot of information, yes. Okay, so I forgot to mention, but this is the first time I present the report, because unfortunately last year I was supposed to present it in Wales, but the plans changed, and so I thought that was a lot of information. I'm aware I probably went very fast on certain aspects. I'm really sorry. But if you have any questions, or like, you can ask the organizers about my details. If you can read the report, you can write to me if you have any questions. I'll be very, very pleased to talk further. Okay, in terms of creating predictability. All right. So that's an interesting question, because I think the answer here is really twofold, and I'm going to be very blunt. There's this idea even in mainstream economics, and I think that's a valid point of mainstream economics, that the most powerful policy moves are the ones that are not anticipated by the markets. So I would say, actually, you need to create predictability. And how to do it? Okay, you need to have a plan in terms of everything current account related, especially trade related. You need to be able to have forecasts on what your inflows and outflows will be as far as incomes are concerned. So obviously the state pension would probably be managed by, now we're talking about Scotland, would be managed by the Scottish government. But what about the private pensions? It's very likely that people would receive payments in Great British pound. Okay. And so all those things obviously would need to be considered, put into like spreadsheets, plans, and so on and so forth. So this way you show, okay, we've got a plan, we know where we're going. You would probably need to change your tax system, like to make it more consistent with the political orientations of Scotland, to make it consistent for a standalone country. Probably the Scandinavian model as a whole would probably be a good influence. At the same time, keep in mind that you may want to keep some room for surprises. So if you divulge everything, the financial markets will anticipate and sometimes misinterpret. Let's face it, they're not perfect. So you want to be strategic in how you divulge information. And one aspect I didn't delve into details, but is Singapore. When you look at their exchange rate regime. So Singapore, they have no central official parity. Okay, so they have a band. Okay, there's a band. That band is defined against a basket of currencies. Okay, and it crawls. Okay, so you have a band that crawls against a basket of currency. Now get this: neither the width of the band, the composition of the basket of currency, and the speed of the crawl is officially disclosed. Okay, so basically, from like an external perspective, they may as well be floating. It wouldn't make much of a difference. And you can play on that, okay? And sometimes you can surprise the market, and sometimes it's actually the right thing to do. Although I know we talk a lot about, you know, being transparent and so on and so forth, but the truth is sometimes it's not the best thing to do. So I would say, yes, you need to provide a consistent picture, but you also need to keep in mind that sometimes circumstances will dictate otherwise, and you need to have a few alternative plans, and you ideally should not disclose everything to the markets beforehand. And I know that's controversial to say.
That was a wonderful presentation, and there are various technical points which I think I would like to follow up on. Your reply to the first question immediately had me thinking about Keynes and thinking about his preference, and indeed the way Singapore works, his preference for autonomous organisations which are free from political control but guided by wise people. And perhaps that's an objective which we could reach in Scotland. It would certainly be different from what happened in Brexit. My question, though, which I have, and I'm partly aware that Leslie Riddoch is in the audience, who has done a wonderful film on how Denmark has developed. But my recollection, when I was an undergraduate student in economics in the 1980s, Denmark was being held up as a country which had all sorts of problems with its balance of payments. And essentially, I think what has been successful in Denmark since then is very much what you've talked about in your closing remarks. That is to say that there was a political agreement which led to stability, allowing long-term growth. And so the position which Denmark finds itself in now, I noticed you were saying stabilisation might take 20 years. The position which Denmark finds itself in now, I think, has resemblances to what you're talking about. And knowing that you're in Denmark just now, perhaps you actually have some insights that you'd be able to provide us with. So it's really a comment. It's really, I suppose, a response to what you've said. But the question is, what do you would I be right in assuming that that Denmark actually provides a good template for Scotland in the future?
Thank you very much for the question. Okay, regarding the first part, yes. Okay, so that's actually one of the. I think Keynes was influenced by Edmund Burke in that respect. It's something I actually think about sometimes, because some people might say, "Oh, but having those institutions managed by wise people, is that really democratic?" Then I look at some democracies and I look at yes, let's say stupidity presiding over democracy, and I'm thinking, oh, I don't know what's the best way forward is, but I surely sometimes wonder how to strike a balance between openness and ability to reflect the will of the people, and at the same time ensuring um, a certain level of not just expertise, but competency, but competency in a competitive way as well, not just something centered around a microcosmic sort of groupthink, as can happen, for instance, in economics, or in even in places like the European Union, to be fair. But yes, it's an interesting point. Regarding Denmark, okay, so here's my take on Denmark. First of all, they were a little bit lucky because in the 70s they discovered oil and gas. Okay, so they really suffered through the first oil shock in 73 and 4, as many countries did, including the UK. They did better during the second one, and from the early 80s onwards, they were able to use those fossil fuel reserves, and that improved their trade and current account position. However, this is not the only factor. They also, because it's true, they kind of were in trouble. Let's say they were in chronic deficit before, and there were lots of social tensions. In the 80s, they decided to fix their currency, but they devalued in the first place. They fixed their currency. They have a relatively high rate, especially on income tax. Okay, they don't have national insurance contribution equivalent, but they have a very high income tax rate. It's 45% for average people. And what that does is a bit like Germany. It will constrain the ability, the purchasing power of people. So from that, they will not overspend, and that will reduce the kind of leakages through imports. So I think those two factors, the fact that three factors, the oil and gas discovery, fixing the exchange rate lower in the first place, and the tax system, and you could add as well that they have this very strong sense of, well, they are quite nationalistic, you could say. It means that it kind of ensures this kind of socioeconomic integrity. I should add as well, trade unions are extremely important in Denmark. They are compulsory. Okay, so when I joined the University of Aalborg, and keep in mind I was in the UK before, so pretty much the polar opposite. You don't have unions in most places, but I was contacted by a union representative that even negotiated some of my pay on my behalf. Okay, and that's why you don't have Amazon, you don't have Uber officially operating in Denmark, is because union membership is compulsory, and those companies didn't want to have unions, to deal with unions. So Denmark said, well, sorry, we won't have you here. So yeah. Yes, I would agree. There are some lessons to be learned from Denmark. There might be differences, but I would say yes, in a way. The same way I kind of see Denmark as this northern, more rich version of Germany. I'm not saying Scotland is richer than England, for instance. It might be richer than England on average. There will be definitely parallels to draw, yes. I hope I answered every aspect of your question as well as possible, and please feel free to follow up on the other points.
In half an hour. So, what I want to do today, I can't go through, I'm basing this on direction. There's copies of it here. We don't have a card reader with us, so but it's £5. You can get a copy. Grab me afterwards. Rory will be here for a while. Rory's on next. The fact that he's in crutches, it's not because Commonweal's rough. He was playing rugby for Scotland the other weekend, so that's the reason for that. But Rory will be about for a while afterwards. I don't really have time to do the full presentation of this because there's a lot in this, and I don't want to do that today. I also think it's probably at a point in this movement where we probably want to be chatting, so I'm going to talk for a small time and we'll just do questions about any of this because it's quite a broad field. I want to know what people think because... What, you want me louder? Folk never say that. Right, so let me first of all go over what I want to do today, because what I want to do today is emphasize some of the bits that I want you to think about, and I want to emphasize the bit I don't want you to think about. What I don't want you to think about is that this is a pick off another, take it off the shelf, all enclosed, one-person plan, because I am trying to emphasize that the Messiah complexes that we've had in this independence movement have not helped us. When you develop good strategy, it's collectively owned. If you want to get collectively owned strategy, you develop it collectively. Now, this is the biggest problem that we've had. We haven't had a strategy that the movement as a whole has felt ownership with, so we haven't been able to engage with it well, we haven't been able to shape it, and we haven't been able to drive it forwards. So the first thing that I want to say is, this is a framework which I think helps us hopefully have a conversation about what we need to do, what we want to do, and how we go forward. But it's not, I'm not offering you this as a tablet of stone. That's the first thing that I want to say. And the second thing that I want to say is I have spent a lifetime working in the Ministry of Possibilities. It's a cool place and I love it and it gets me out of the bed in the morning. But my concern is the lack of action in the Ministry of Nuts and Bolts, right? It's the Ministry of Nuts and Bolts that's bothering me. And there's no time for clapping, folks, leave it. And what I would usually do at this point is I would usually use it as an example. I say, if you want to see what we should be doing as a movement, I would usually say, go and look at the Scottish Currency Group. But I'm here. So what I want to say is you're doing the right things. This is what we should be doing. That is more thinking that we've just seen in that presentation in Scottish independence than this movement's managed to pull together at certainly at an official level in the last 10 years. That is the level that we should be working at. That is the level that we should be thinking at, and we're not. So what I want to do, that's how you do a currency. You get people that know how to do a currency and you listen to them, right? What I want to do here is give you a little bit of the nuts and bolts of developing a campaign just as a kind of setup. Now, there's no thing here for me to keep an eye on how long I'm talking. I do want to leave time for chat, so if anyone's timing it, shout me. So let me start. First of all, if you're running a campaign, work out what it is you're running a campaign for, right? So how did you get independence? What is it? Now, I think we've got a bit lost in this because we've been so obsessed with process. How do you get a referendum, or how do you skip a referendum, that we've not been thinking about what it is we want a referendum for. So the fast version of this is, what is independence? Right? We keep talking about this, but we haven't actually defined what is independence. The long and short of this is, there's no definition of being an independent country. There's no place you can go and say you are or you aren't. There are people who are in degrees of independence. There's one primary measure that says you're an independent country, and it's that you're a member of the United Nations. That's the best measure of being independent. Everyone else identifies you as being independent. And all I want to say at the moment is how we get that, I want to leave to the end. Because that's helpful, but because what we have to do, first of all, is get to the situation where we can be accepted by the United Nations. Now, I would argue there's two ways that you do that. One is total territorial domination. Now, that just means facts on the ground, but that means we would need to take complete military control of our land area, right? So people will acknowledge a country if it is in complete territorial control. We don't want a civil war, so let's just set that to the side. The other way that independent countries have become members of the United Nations is through a recognition agreement with the body, the nation that they are separating from. Now, what that does is, everyone else says, well, if the UK doesn't mind that Scotland's leaving, neither do we. What we are trying to do, when we say Scottish independence, what we are trying to do is get the UK to the negotiating table to produce a recognition agreement. That is our purpose. When we do that, we can join the United Nations and we can work our way out of things. So how do we do that? Okay, now, I want to first of all say that in everything I'm saying here, none of this is Commonweal. All of this is my other career as a political strategist, political lobbyist. It is a science influence. Billions upon billions upon billions of pounds are spent on influence professions every year. Advertising, fundraising, marketing, sales, political lobbying, political strategy, political campaigning. All of these are influence industries. And these influence industries are they spend billions because they are worth trillions. This is a massive field. And when you've got that much money on the table, people do research. Right, so we know what works, and we're constantly learning more all the time about what works. So to give you an example, it is now routine to put somebody in an MRI scanner and give them various political slogans or comments to see how their brain reacts. We're learning the different ways that people respond to messaging. Now, this is an iterative field. The more people invest in understanding influence, the more that we gain, the more knowledge that we gain from this. We need to start using these approaches, because the next thing I'm going to say is, I should have said earlier on, I'm leaving the whole point about how do you actually get them to the negotiating table to the end, because I've been calling that the trigger point. Right? Stop worrying about that. That's the referendum or the UDI or the constitutional, whatever it is. Right, that's at the end. We need to have the settled will of the public to do that. We live in a democracy. There is no version of the United Nations saying, come on in, Scotland, if we are sitting at 50% or below. That's that simple. So we have to have our audience shifted. Our audience is not that big. We have got 45, anyway, solid percentage of the population. There is about another 8-9% who are undecided. Then there's about 50% that are on the other side, more or less. of which about 20% only hold that view very loosely. Now, that's 30% of the UK adult, of the Scottish adult population, which is make or break. There is no point worrying about 30% of actual hardcore unionism. We have spent 10 years fighting them on social media, and guess what? We're not independent. Let them be. We're not going to persuade them, and we're not going to persuade our target audience through a fist fight with them. We've got to stop that, and we've got to open up a conversation with our target audience. That is crucial. And to do that, we have to understand them. We have taken no interest in our target audience. We have done almost no public attitude research work, and certainly very little focused on the group that we need to talk to. This is a mistake. Some of it has been done, but it's out of date. So we did this in 2000. We spent about £15,000 and then about another £20,000 with the Scottish Independence Convention on this exact subject. Now, there's so much I'd like to tell you, so much. But I haven't got time, so what I'm going to focus on is the overwhelming message that came out of this. Now, this is really important. Nobody was telling us they didn't understand what independence was. Okay, so we've got a lot of theories that kick about this movement, about what it is that shifts people over the next line. And some people are saying, we need to give them the sense of what you can do with independence. They get it. They understand what an independent country is. There's no point in explaining what an independent country is. It doesn't help them. Second of all, bigging up Scotland in and of itself doesn't matter, because believe me, if you don't believe in Scotland as a nation, you're not in that category, right? You're not in there. These people are proud of their country. They respond well. I was slightly surprised by this. They responded well to saltires. They don't associate saltires with division and referendums. They associate saltires with Murrayfield and Hampden and celebrations and gala days and fun and their nation. There's no pride problem. There isn't even actually a massive confidence in the idea of Scotland problem. Most of them get the idea that if Scotland was independent, we would be a comparatively modern, rich nation, and somehow we'll make it work. The barrier. So what they said was, over and over again, we loved the Yes campaign. It was positive. It talked about the kind of future that we wanted. Everybody, and I mean every single person that we did this with, hated the No campaign. It was grinding, and it was negative, and it was everything you can't do, and it was talking down Scotland. These aren't the problems. The question is, why didn't they cross the road? They liked our campaign. They didn't like the campaign on the other side of the road, but they didn't cross. Why? The answer is simple. They didn't have confidence in us. It's not lack of confidence in Scotland. It's not lack of confidence in the future. It's not because they're inherently conservative. It's because if you say you're going to go out and take a wonderful journey in a boat, and they don't believe your boat is seaworthy, they won't get on. That is the primary difficulty that we've got. Now, if you go and you look at what it is that they were saying gave them that impression, and I am begging everybody, be subtle about this. People don't make opinions based on individual things. It's not this one thing. You absorb a number of impressions, and they give you a sense of what you feel, what you think. So when I say it's currency, but it wasn't currency, what that means is our target audience did not have in their mind a correct currency option. If you'd said to them, what exchange rate should Scotland be operating at, they would go, bleh. That's not the point. They haven't got an answer in their head. But they asked us, and we blinked, right? So we said, currency union. Osborne said no. They said, what's your plan B? And we went, bleh. And what they said was not, you failed to find my answer, but you didn't have an answer, right? So you weren't prepared. And if you're not prepared to introduce a currency, I can't trust my pension with you. I can't trust my mortgage with you. That is why we're not winning, right? It's nothing to do with mere pictures of bloody wind turbines or hills. It's the Ministry of Nuts and Bolts. Okay? So the Ministry of Nuts and Bolts has got to get its finger out here. It's got to find a way to take these reasonable questions and have sensible, reasonable answers, which you could do by engaging with an entire planet full of intellectuals and thinkers and experts and bankers and border control experts, and everything is there. We're not talking to them, we're not building. We need to answer the questions. I explained how I would go about doing it in this. There's a number of ways we can do it. I'm not being proprietorial, but we do not need a chatting shop of the public at the moment. We need hard work to get these questions answered. The confidence point is really important. I'm going to tell you this because I find this fun. So another thing that we did a big poll, and we did something that you do in professional marketing, which we, of course, as a movement never do, which is we did psychographics. So you all know what demographics are. That's external characteristics of a person, grouping groups in the society by external characteristics of age or sex or salary or class or geography. Psychographics does the same for our internal characteristics. And we did a series of questions to try to find out what are the internal characteristics spread of the voters. And it's really clear. No voters have, certainly the unionist side of no voters, have low self-confidence. Right? They have low personal confidence, they have low collective confidence. This is partly why we're wrong to assume that as people get older, they will carry their political views with them unchanged. We don't. We become more nervous about the world because we're less capable of engaging it as we get older, and we become more risk-averse. Right, so, we're getting 10 minutes here. I promised I was leaving time for chat. So, what we've got to do is we've got to build people's confidence using this. The second thing that we've got to do is we've got to find a way to talk to them. Now, this is one of my things, and I talk about it a lot. Distributed activism, peer-to-peer messaging, all sorts of things. We've got to stop worrying about the media. We have the numbers when we are active to talk directly to an audience. This is one of the most effective methods that's developed in global activism campaigning of late. Social media is dead. It isn't effective anymore. It's a mess. The television isn't enough. You cannot bark at people over a screen anymore and change their views. You need to engage. All it really does is nothing complicated. It just says, we need to get cut to the chase. There's 300 to 400,000 people that give us a 60% victory. That's it, right? 300 or 400,000 people in Scotland, if they change their mind, we win 60-40. Okay, so they're what we're going to talk about. Surely we can get 100,000 of us together to link with 3 people each and talk to them. Now, that's greatly underplaying the complexity and the effectiveness of this. But that's what you do. Peer-to-peer communication to pass these messages on, to give them a route to ask questions and to reassure themselves. Now, everything that I've seen tells me that getting to 60% is realistic. Getting to 65% is possible. Getting to 70% is theoretically possible. It's not going to happen, right? So we've got to get to 60 because we've got to beat the No campaign from 2014 at the very least, right? We've got to beat them. You can do it in numbers, you can do it in percentage, but if we come out with a 52%, then that's a 1-1 draw, isn't it? We've got to beat them now. So we've got to get over 55, we've got to get the closest 60 as we can. What I'm then going to say is, so how do we get independence? Oh, if you're sitting at 60% of the polls, let's talk, right? When we're sitting at 60% of the polls, I'll give you a dozen ways to do it. One of the ways that I think we underestimate is the old phone call method where you go, hello, Westminster, we're at 60%, you're beat, hold a referendum, we will thump you and our hand will be strengthened, why don't you just come and negotiate now, right? That's usually how it works. Most countries don't have referendums to become independent, okay? But we can use a referendum mode. I've suggested one in here that's completely in our power, which is to use a petition system run by the Electoral Reform Society or Electoral Reform Services. So you're verifying names on a single proposition rather than a dual proposition. And you can do the same thing. You can demonstrate that we've got 60% of the population without having to engage at all in the other half of it. You could even start debating whether there's some version of UDI that you can use as a leverage point. I warn you, they can switch off the national grid from London. Do not overestimate our ability to UDI painlessly, but in theory, okay? So what I'm saying is that if we get our, great, let's keep doing the think work. I mean, that's what Commonweal's for. That's what I enjoy in life. Let's think about the better Scotland. But if we want to actually get this done, we need the Ministry of Nuts and Bolts to start working. There is no mystery about this. There is no complicated theory that you can't understand. This is straightforward. Every campaign that wins everywhere in the world, and I don't care if it's for shampoo or it's for voting rights, every single one of them that ever won knows what its target audience is, learns about that target audience, finds out what it needs from them to get that target audience to come over, and does those things, and then goes back and talks to that target audience. That's it. Everybody who ever wins does that. Everybody who doesn't do that loses. We're not doing that. There's a dozen ways we could. We've got to get started with it now. Finally, because I've only got 5 minutes for questions, sorry, but finally, what does this mean for us? My guess, this takes about 18 months, 2 years to set up. From there, I think you can do it in 3 years. So I think we can be at 60% in 5 years, for certain. And interestingly, that takes us to 2031, which will be 15 years, which is a generation, so we could always take that as the point. We can do this fast, and I really mean this. The problem is not how long it takes us to do this. The problem is how long it takes us to get out of our own road. We are the people blocking us. We could have started this 10 years ago. We could start it tomorrow. The people who are stopping us are us. If we get out our own way, we're 5 years away. I really believe that. Right, sorry, I've talked too much. I didn't mean to. As many questions as you can squeeze in whatever time. Oh, and sorry, I've got to take my daughter and her 15-year-old pals to a gig in Glasgow tonight. And usually I've hung about and chatted. I've got to shoot down the road because I've got an electric car, so I've got to get down there, get it charged, and get it back in the night. And I'm going to be hanging about the QM Union like I'm a kid again. I can't wait. So I can't hang about afterwards. So just as many questions as we can squeeze in, and just shout us when we're done. Well, again, this is what I'm saying. I've made a suggestion. My suggestion quickly was that the way that you would do this if they were UK, right? So it's good to use things that people are familiar with. In the UK, you would have done this sort of thing through a royal commission. We can't have a royal commission, but I'm fairly confident that given that the Scottish Government has financed think tanks which work beyond devolved issues in the past, I'm pretty sure it could set up a national commission and fund it from Holyrood. Take it out of Parliament. We're not going to win this in Parliament. Get it out of Parliament. So give a grant to create a national commission. But, I mean, Simon's been looking at a slightly different model for it. I don't care, right? I don't really mind. We've just got to get the work done. We've got to get the work done in a way that's got maximum credibility to reach our target audience. So that's exactly what I mean by, I don't want to dictate it. I'm just telling you, this is what we need to do. How we do it, there's lots of ways we could do it. Yeah, except for they can't. I can hear you anyway, but.
That's acquired it. It's resolved by some kind of negotiation, some kind of a treaty, right? I mean, we had a treaty of amity with America in 1783. You know, all the countries, and it ends up with a treaty. Now, that's not the problem. The problem is, what do you have to do to get them to negotiate? Mm-hmm. What kind of pressure can you put on them to make you listen to your democratic mandate, even if you have one? Mm-hmm. And that's the issue. Now, Walter Scott said many years ago, nobody's nails can reach the length of Lunnon. Is that how do we in Scotland put any pressure on the UK government to force them to negotiate? We're just hoping that, like, they'll be nice, and that when they see that we're disenchanted, they'll allow us to go. I just really don't think that that's going to happen without some form of pressure that we can apply to them. And I'm scratching my head thinking what that could be.
Right, so I think sometimes we've got a risk of over-talking how strong Westminster is, right? Asking them to give us a referendum from 47% is asking them to be nice. Asking them to give us negotiations for independence from 65% support, it's not nice. It's bog standard normal democracy. Now, how would we do it? First of all, I think I really, really think that how this usually happens is as soon as a nation state realises the game's up, it changes its mindset. And my bigger concern is not that they will stonewall. My bigger concern is the second they realise we are winning, their entire efforts are going to go into screwing us over in negotiations, right? That's my worry. In a democracy, it is really, really hard to hold, especially when you've given the precedent of 2014. It would be really, really hard to hold people in a nation against their will once you've got a clear majority. Now, what my suggestion is step one, give them a phone. Step two, ask them for a referendum. Step three, take every polling station in Scotland, the normal ones, hire them for a weekend, hire electoral reform services to run every single one of them, put a proposition that just says, I want Scotland to be an independent country, run a massive carnival-esque campaign to turn out. Remember, we've got, in theory, if we did this model, our 400,000 target, we've already got them buddied up. All you've got to do is get each one person's only got to get their 3 targets to the polling station, along with all the supporters, and we've got a number which represents 60% of the Scottish population voting. I think that puts us in a really strong position. If that didn't work, my next immediate step is, the day after that happened, I would send down cultural ambassadors. I would find every single senior and respected figure in Scotland that we possibly could to get down to Scotland and sit with a decision maker and say to a columnist, a politician or whatever, and really start the lobbying, say you're going to create a situation of severe internal disruption. You cannot keep this going. If they don't listen to this, and you're not convinced, I promise you, there's hardly a Liberal commentator that thinks that we shouldn't be out by on 52, 53%. If we're at 60%, the mood and the tone will change completely. If that doesn't happen, we can escalate to direct action. We can start closing down Westminster with protests and various things. I don't believe it's getting there. I think you're overestimating Westminster. They want to keep hold of us. They know they can't keep hold of us once they've lost us, and they will change their direction, is my view. What I can promise you is there is no other route. I can absolutely promise you that there is nobody else on the planet is going to give us our independence easily without a recognition agreement with the UK one way or the other. We cannot be Kosovo. That's my number one rule. We cannot be out but not out. We have to be able to trade with the world on equal terms. That's going to require UN and WTO. We can't do that without a recognition agreement. We need to get one. We have to be able to trade with the UK. We have to have their cooperation in the transition. It's not an option. We have to do it. So the question is, number one, let's get into the position where we can exert the pressure. And as we're doing that, we've got a leisurely 5 years to come up with a detailed set of plans. I've put ideas in this. There's lots of other ideas that you can bring in, but from 60%, you're in a strong position. There's lots and lots that you can do. I really, really believe that. Sorry, I was going to... Oh, there's so many. I'm going to intervene and ask a question, and we'll probably then have to move on to the next person. But the SNP leadership, in my view,